The room smelled of stale tobacco and desperation. It was August 1991, and in a conference hall in Moscow, Soviet Finance Minister Valentin Pavlov was explaining to a group of Western bankers that the USSR needed another bridge loan, not a large one, just enough to cover debt service payments due in 30 days. Maybe $5 billion? The bankers listened politely, took notes, and said they would consult with their governments. Everyone in that room understood what was not being said aloud. The Soviet Union, the superpower that had split the atom and faced down America for half a century, was bankrupt. It had been bankrupt for years, and the only thing keeping the entire structure from collapsing was the willingness of creditors to pretend otherwise. 3 weeks later, the Soviet Union would cease to exist. The red flag would come down from the Kremlin for the last time. 15 republics would declare independence. The Cold War would be declared over, won by the West through superior values and political systems. That was the story that would be told in every newspaper and history book. It was not the truth. The truth was that the Soviet Union did not fall to ideology or military pressure or the aspirations of subject peoples. It fell because it ran out of money. And when a state built entirely on the promise of economic superiority runs out of money, there's nothing left to believe in. The collapse was not a revolution. It was a liquidation. But the crisis did not begin in 1991. It began in 1973, in a country the Soviet leadership barely considered relevant. Saudi Arabia was not supposed to matter. It was a desert kingdom propped up by American interests, producing oil that the world bought at prices that barely covered costs. The Soviet Union produced its own oil, vast quantities of it, pumped from fields in Siberia that seemed inexhaustible. Soviet planners watched global energy markets the way a man with a well watches his neighbor buy water, with amusement and a certain contempt. Then, in October 1973, Arab nations launched an oil embargo against the West. Prices quadrupled in a matter of months. A barrel of crude that had sold for $3 in September was selling for $12 by January. The embargo was supposed to punish America and Europe for supporting Israel. But the country that benefited most was not in the Middle East at all. The Soviet Union suddenly found itself sitting on an ocean of liquid currency. Every barrel of Siberian crude it sold to Europe now brought 4 times the revenue with no increase in production costs. The foreign exchange reserves of the USSR began to swell. Western banks, flush with petrodollars from the Gulf states and desperate to find borrowers, came offering credit at terms that seemed too good to refuse. The Soviet leadership, which had spent decades preaching self-sufficiency, discovered something more intoxicating than ideology: leverage. Between 1973 and 1980, Soviet oil revenue increased 7-fold. The money should have been used to reform the economy, modernize agriculture, develop consumer industries. Instead, it was used to subsidize everything that was already failing. Inefficient factories stayed open because the state could afford the losses. Collective farms that produced nothing continued to receive equipment and fuel. The military budget expanded even as the economy underneath it stagnated. The Communist Party kept food prices frozen at 1960s levels and made up the difference with oil money. It was not economic planning. It was morphine for a dying patient. Leonid Brezhnev understood none of this. He was not an economist. He was a political survivor who had risen by never threatening anyone important and never asking difficult questions. Under his leadership, the Soviet Union became a gerontocracy, ruled by old men who measured success by the absence of crisis. As long as the oil money kept flowing, there was no crisis. The shelves in Moscow might be empty, but the army was funded. The factories might produce junk, but they produced it on schedule. The system worked, in the sense that it continued to exist. But in the background, a different set of numbers was accumulating. Numbers that did not appear in Pravda or in speeches at party congresses. The Soviet Union was borrowing, not just from its own people through inflation and forced savings, but from Western banks that were happy to lend to a superpower with oil reserves. The debt was denominated in hard currency, dollars and Deutschmarks, which meant it had to be repaid in hard currency. As long as oil prices stayed high, this was manageable. The Soviet Union could sell crude, earn dollars, service its debts, and use what was left to import the grain and technology it could not produce domestically. The entire structure depended on oil staying above $30 per barrel. No one in Moscow seemed to consider what would happen if it did not. In 1985, 2 things happened that would destroy the Soviet Union. The first was that Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary. The second was that oil prices began to fall. Gorbachev was young by Soviet standards, only 54, and he believed the system could be reformed. He introduced glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. He allowed criticism of the government. He permitted limited market reforms. He withdrew troops from Afghanistan. He negotiated arms reductions with the United States. Western leaders praised him as a visionary, a communist, who understood that the future required change. What they did not understand, and what Gorbachev himself may not have fully grasped, was that the Soviet economy was not broken in a way that reform could fix. It was broken in a way that only increasing amounts of money could conceal. and the money was running out, oil prices collapsed in 1986. A combination of increased production from non-OPEC sources and reduced demand from a global recession sent crude below $10 per barrel. For the Soviet Union, this was not a recession. It was a cardiac event. 70% of Soviet hard currency earnings came from energy exports. When prices fell by 2/3, so did the state's ability to import food, service foreign debt, and subsidize the entire economy. Soviet gold reserves began to drain. The USSR started selling gold on international markets to cover short-term obligations, liquidating the reserves that had been accumulated over decades. By 1988, Soviet gold holdings had fallen from 2,000 tons to less than 300. Western intelligence agencies tracked the sales and understood what they meant. The Soviet Union was selling the furniture to pay rent. Foreign debt, which had seemed manageable when oil was expensive, became crushing when oil was cheap. The USSR owed over $60 billion to Western creditors by 1989, and it was struggling to make interest payments. Western banks began to refuse new loans unless the Soviet Union agreed to IMF-style reforms: price liberalization, privatization, budget discipline. It was a quiet form of regime change. The creditors did not need to invade. They just needed to wait. Gorbachev's reforms accelerated the collapse rather than preventing it. Glasnost allowed people to speak openly about how bad things had become. Perestroika disrupted the command economy without replacing it with anything functional. State enterprises were told to become self-financing, but they had no idea how to operate without central directives and subsidies. Production fell, shortages worsened. The black market became the only market that worked. By 1990, the Soviet Union was in a state of economic freefall. Inflation was approaching triple digits. Store shelves in major cities were empty of basic goods. The ruble, which had been pegged to gold and traded at official rates for decades, was effectively worthless outside the country. Inside the country, people were using cigarettes and vodka as currency because they held value better than paper money. And then the republics began to secrete their own money. It started quietly. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, the Baltic states that had been annexed in 1940 and never accepted Soviet rule, they began issuing coupons that functioned as parallel currencies, allowing local goods to be purchased only by residents. It was a way to prevent Moscow from extracting resources from regions that were already starving. Other republics watched and learned. Ukraine issued karbovanets. Belarus issued coupons. Even Russia, the heart of the Soviet Union, began preparing its own currency. What was happening was not a political revolution. It was a monetary disintegration. The Soviet Union was not a nation. It was a monetary union held together by the ruble and enforced by the security services. When the ruble lost credibility and the security services lost funding, there was nothing left to hold the structure together. The August 1991 coup attempt was a last desperate move by hardliners who understood that reform meant dissolution. They placed Gorbachev under house arrest and declared emergency rule, hoping that a show of force would restore order. But you cannot restore order to a bankrupt state with tanks. The coup failed not because of Boris Yeltsin standing on a vehicle, but because the military itself was not being paid. Soldiers were not going to fire on crowds for a government that could not feed them. When the coup collapsed, so did the last pretense of Soviet authority. Yeltsin, who led the Russian Republic, understood something that Gorbachev did not. The Soviet Union was a liability. Russia could not reform the USSR because the other republics were draining resources from the center. The only way to save Russia was to cut them loose. In December 1991, Yeltsin met with the leaders of Ukraine and Belarus and signed an agreement dissolving the Soviet Union. It was not a revolutionary act. It was a bankruptcy proceeding. 3 men in a room decided that the debts of the Union would die with the Union, and Russia would start fresh. Gorbachev was not invited. He learned of the decision from news reports. On December 25, 1991, he resigned a position that no longer existed, and the Soviet flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the final time. The aftermath was not freedom. It was one of the largest asset liquidations in human history. State enterprises that had been owned collectively were suddenly privatized, sold to whoever had the cash or connections to buy them. Western consultants arrived with textbooks about free markets and shock therapy. They advised the Russian government to eliminate price controls, privatize everything, and let the market sort it out. The result was the transfer of trillions of dollars worth of resources from public to private hands in less than 5 years. The oligarchs were not entrepreneurs. They were men who understood that in a collapsing state, proximity to power is more valuable than talent. They bought oil companies, steel mills, banks, media empires, usually for a fraction of their value, often with loans from the very institutions they were purchasing. It was not capitalism. It was looting with legal paperwork. The population suffered in ways that are difficult to overstate. Life expectancy in Russia fell by 5 years between 1991 and 1994. Pensions became worthless overnight as inflation consumed savings. Hospitals ran out of medicine, schools closed. The social safety net that had been the one genuine achievement of Soviet governance simply vanished because there was no money to fund it. People who had lived their entire lives under the promise that the state would provide discovered that the state had been selling off their future for decades, and now the bill had come due. The West declared victory in the Cold War, and in a sense, it had won. But the victory was not ideological, it was financial. The Soviet Union had tried to match American military spending without the economic base to sustain it. It had borrowed to cover the gap, betting that oil prices would stay high and that the command economy would eventually catch up to the West in productivity. Both bets failed. The Cold War did not end because communism was morally inferior. It ended because the Soviet Union went bankrupt first, and America's creditors were more patient. The tragedy was not just the collapse, it was what came after. Russia spent the 1990s in economic chaos, ruled by oligarchs and weakened by corruption. The population grew cynical, nostalgic for the stability of the Soviet era, even if that stability had been an illusion. When a strongman emerged promising to restore order and national pride, they embraced him, not because they wanted authoritarianism, but because they wanted to stop feeling like their country was being auctioned off to the highest bidder. The Soviet collapse was not a morality tale about the triumph of freedom over tyranny. It was a case study in what happens when a state builds its legitimacy on economic promises it cannot keep, borrows to maintain the illusion, and then discovers that creditors are less forgiving than commissars. The Kremlin still stands the same building where Soviet leaders once commanded, half the world now occupied by a different regime that learned a different lesson from the collapse. That power without solvency is just theater, that empires fall not when they lose wars, but when they cannot pay their debts. And that the only thing more dangerous than economic failure is allowing people to see the balance sheet before the end.